God is so good.
Good morning. I'll be ready in just a minute. We're turning to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew 5. If you could turn your Bibles there. Let me move the Bible for you. Okay, it's been a little bit. It's been a minute. So, the great thing about the Sermon on the Mount is you can pick up almost anywhere and get right back to work. So Matthew chapter 5, and of course we've covered the introduction to preparing people for the kingdom in those Beatitudes, and we saw Jesus was preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and we saw coming out of that character that is transformed by Christ, there's an influence that comes from that character, and he talks about the salt and the light and reflecting the light of God. We talk quite a bit about that. He speaks also to probably one of the major charges against Jesus. Based on Matthew 5:17 through 20 or so, what would you think the Jewish leadership may have been charging Jesus with? Yeah, he's an enemy of the law. I mean, he's trying to destroy the law, which would have been a major accusation, and there would have been consequences of that. What would Jesus' response be, or what is it here? Seems like he's anticipating that. Yes, he was the fulfillment of the law. And interestingly, along that line, as we move through the Sermon on the Mount, and there's several threads of this, he is preaching the gospel of the kingdom, which was promised. He is preparing people to enter into his kingdom, but his kingdom is a fulfillment of Old Testament text. So actually, who was it who were the real enemies of the law and the prophets? Was it? Yeah, it was the Pharisees, and there's several ways they do that, by binding their traditions over the Word of God. They also were actually denying the need to obey certain commandments through their traditions. We see that in Matthew chapter 15. And so it's so interesting because they're casting this accusation at Jesus, but actually they're the ones that are trying to set aside God's law and what God has said for their own traditions. And that will continue to come out. Now, the major contrast we see, and this is kind of a formula of sorts, Jesus contrasts two things. He says, it has been said, but what? But I say unto you. Okay. And when we've talked about that, there is a sense in which some of those concepts, when he says it has been said, you think, okay, is he talking about the Old Testament text? And in a sense, but not exactly. When he says it has been said, there are occasions where clearly the law did not say that, the prophets didn't say that, but who had said it? The Pharisees. That the rabbinical interpretation of the law was such. So it has been said, these things have been interpreted in this way for you in the past, but I say to you, now there's two aspects of that. Is he defending what the Old Testament scripture actually said? Yeah, but he's going further to see the fullness of that interpretation. And when he says, I'm saying to you, he's saying this is my law, this is my truth, but it's not attacking Old Testament text. It's the fulfillment of that in the kingdom. So if you really care about the law and the prophets, who are you going to follow? You're going to follow Jesus. I mean, and there were faithful Jews who did that. Simeon was looking for the Messiah, and there were others who came to understand that. So we're right in the heart of that in Matthew 5, and you'll notice we had talked about some of these early verses. He talks about unrighteous anger, the idea of throwing out accusations that certainly are not true or hurtful. And so what he's doing is he's saying, yes, it's wrong to murder, but what lies behind murdering overtly, physically? Unrighteous anger. And are you sure that you haven't been guilty of that? Certainly they had. We looked at verses 23 and 24, even verse 25, where we talked about reconciliation and the desire to reconcile with my brother and understanding that there's a connection between my view of God and my relationship with God and my relationship with others. And that got us down to, let's look at verse 27. I tell you what, let's read verses 27 through 32. That section kind of goes together, and there's some major concepts here we need to talk about. So verses 27 through 32, who would like to, Carl Hunt? Sorry, didn't see you in time, Austin. Carl, if you would.
You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. Furthermore, it has been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual morality causes her to commit adultery. Whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's go back, and we did mention some of this, but I'd like to revisit it because it plays into some of the things he's going to say about divorce. Notice, if you'll notice with me, in this text, he's digging into the heart issue behind particular sins. Now, let me ask this. Did the law, and especially the prophets, when you think about what they said, were there sections where they were digging into the heart condition of Israel behind what they were doing? Yes. Okay, the answer is yes. So the old idea, I know we've talked about, but I think it's really important because, I even hear gospel preachers sometimes say things and you go, oh, no, that's not exactly. When they start talking about the difference in the old and the new, there is a difference in the old and the new. But the notion that God was somewhat indifferent, and I know they don't mean that, but that God is all about, pull up your resume and just those physical things that you did, and that he somehow was not as concerned in the old law or the law and the prophets with the condition of heart that he is in the new. If you ever hear that, that's not what the Bible teaches. Okay, so I could go to Ezekiel, we could go to Malachi, we could go to Jeremiah, we can go to Isaiah. In fact, many times. So for instance, if you look at Matthew 15, when Jesus is talking about them binding their traditions and not having the right heart and all of that, he quotes from Isaiah. He quotes from the prophets to drive that point home about the condition of their heart. When he's asked, what is the greatest commandment? What does he do? He goes back to Deuteronomy 6 to talk about loving the Lord your God with all your heart. Where does that come from? That's Deuteronomy. So just understand, God has always been concerned about the condition of the heart and the impact that has on how we behave and how we live. But that's where so he's always cared about that. Now, Jesus, for the Jewish leadership of his day, goes back to that and takes it to this level that they were in denial of. So if we're going to talk about what was the thinking of the Jewish leadership versus Jesus, yes, but it's because really, in spite of what they said, they were at odds with the law and the prophets and Jesus. Okay. So when we come back to Matthew chapter 5, and this is well known, I mean, you think about the commandments, he said, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. Now, is that one of the 10 commandments? Yeah. And you remember when we studied Numbers and we've studied Joshua and studied the Old Testament, God has always cared about the violation of a covenant relationship, especially a man and his wife. Okay. So, with that said, when they heard that, what are they thinking? What is that restricted to in most people's minds? Well, rightly so. When you think of adultery, and it's really what adultery is, it's the breaking of that one flesh covenant relationship. So we all have a pretty good idea of what sexual immorality is. And there is, let me say this, in all of these, there is a distinction between the act and the thing that leads to the act. So even though Jesus will say, you understand this, but what about that? It's just like when he talks about hate and murder, and John says, if you hate your brother, you're a what? Murderer. Are you precisely a murderer? I mean, you didn't go out and murder somebody. But why does he put those together that way?
To get to the point of being a murderer.
That's right.
You have to develop this.
Yes. So he's not saying one is precisely treated just like the other, or that one is the other. It's a cause and effect argument, and you'll see this in Scripture. So, yes, this effect is condemned, but let's not wait till we get to that point to address this. If you really want to address the problem of murder physically, you have to go back to the problem of murder spiritually and in the heart, right? And you'll see this all the way through, and you see it through Scripture. John does this a lot in 1 John. So he says in verse 27, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now, Jesus is very clear. He doesn't just say, oh, he's committed adultery. Now, some people want to read it that way. They want to read, well, it's the same thing as if you went out and, had an affair with somebody. That's not what Jesus says. And so there are some that have tried to take this passage, even among our brethren, and say, well, if I catch, my spouse lusting, even though they haven't actually committed adultery or sexual immorality in that way, then I can put them away. That's not what Jesus is teaching. Okay? What he is teaching, though, is that we need to be aware that what starts in our heart, if it's not disciplined, is going to be a problem. I mean, it goes to a place, right? You don't just up and have an affair. You don't just up and commit adultery. That's what Jesus is getting to, is let's look at our heart. So before we even get to the actual overt act, there's a whole process. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about, and rightly so, someone who's having an emotional affair. Okay? They may not have physically committed adultery, but that often is what leads to the physical adultery. Right? Jesus is not necessarily saying A equals A, but he is saying A leads to B, right? And if we're going to really address this, we don't just address what we think of as the physical act of adultery, we address what led that person to that. And so as a kingdom citizen, we want to look at our heart and our mind. So when you come back to this, he says, notice verse 28, those who commit adultery, the man who commits adultery with her in his what? Heart. Heart. When Jesus defines adultery in Matthew 19, he talks about the one flesh relationship being violated, and I think we've got a pretty good idea what that entails. So, but he is dealing with the heart here. Look at some other sections of this that I want you to notice when we consider this. Let's talk about the word lust a little bit. A lot of the times when we see the word lust, or just hear the word lust, you think we most of the time assume that's like an evil desire? I mean, most of the time. When you look at the New Testament, the word there, the original word that sometimes is translated desire, depending on your translation. The Old King James always gave it seems like, or most of the time gave us the word lust. It doesn't necessarily mean something evil, but sometimes it does. Here it's certainly evil. We're going to talk about that. But are there times that same word is translated either as lust or desire, that it's not an inherently evil desire? Yes. Okay. It's the same word. Now, what some of the translations have done, and I think we all can be thankful for that, is some of these places, especially I think if you have somebody who has a New King James. Who has a New King James? Anybody? Okay. Bo and Mike, you only have a New King James? Okay. Well, I'm not using you then. Bo, look at Philippians 1:23. I tell you what, Mike, do go look at Ephesians 2:1-3. That'll help. And you'll see what I'm talking about here. Let's see. Jason, Luke 22:15, maybe. So let's look at these passages. Now, so the word where in all of these verses we're about to read, the Greek term is kind of a compound term. You got epi, which is like strong, it's adding intensity, and then the other word is just desire. So it just means strong desire. Right? So the context, you have to look at the context to know how's he using it. If you're using an Old King James Version, which is fine, but just because you see the word lust in a given text doesn't necessarily mean that it's an evil desire. It often is, but there are occasions where maybe that's not the best rendering. So we're going to go Bo and Mike and Jason. Okay? Go, Bo.
Into having a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is part of that.
Now, I think the Old King James included is going to render that as desire. And well, they should have. Same word. Okay? Go ahead.
Ephesians 2:1-3.
Yeah.
And you he made alive, who were dead in trespasses and sins, in which you once walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit who now works in the sons of disobedience, among whom also we all once conducted ourselves in the lusts of our flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, just as the others.
Okay, Jason, go ahead.
22:15.
Yeah, Luke 22:15.
And he said unto them, with desire I have desired to eat this Passover before I suffer.
Okay, so kind of, which we're all pretty aware of here, but kind of a Bible study moment, there's a place to pull your concordance out or whatever, look it up and go, how many times is this word defined this way? How many times is this word defined this way? What we don't do, which is a big preacher mistake, okay, is say, oh, it's used 500 times. 400 of those times it means this. But then there's a whole other 100 times it means something else. So we don't really say, well, it's used most of the time this way. Well, how do we determine? If you have a word and it has multiple possibilities, the word itself, like the lexical word, how do we determine as Bible students how it's being used? Context, context, context. Okay. These 3 verses are a perfect example. And it's not really hard in this way. So when we go back to Bo, well, clearly, what is Paul talking about in Philippians when he says, I've desired to be with Christ? What's he talking about?
He'd rather go to be with Christ in
Yeah, in eternity. Okay, well, clearly that's not an evil desire, right? That's a good desire. Well, now I know that word. It's used in different ways, but I know what it means. I know it's a good and holy desire. So we go to Mike and what he read about fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind. And this is why the Old King James probably renders it as lust. The lust of the flesh and the mind, or the desires of the flesh and the mind. What kind of desire is that? Yeah, it's in a negative context. It's talking about our sin and pre-Christ. Is that hard for me to figure that out? No. So we come to what Jason read. Again, something very good. I've desired to eat this supper with you. Now, it's the same word, y'all. It's the same term, but I'll let the context look at it. Now, there are some other verses that are a little bit more complex, but I look at the context, okay? All I'm saying to you is when you read, just know when I have a word has multiple definitions, I got to look at the context. Okay? That's how I figure out what it means. Now, in the context of Matthew chapter 5 and verse 28, but I say to you that everyone, let's really notice this, who looks at a woman. That word looks is interesting. It's a very deliberate, steadfast looking. So it's not even merely a temptation for a man or a woman that sees somebody and it's an attractive person, okay? So some man sees an attractive lady and she walks by, or a woman sees a man and thinks he's a handsome man. That's not necessarily a violation of that passage, okay? Because at that point you make a decision. So when you think about temptation, Satan presents something to us. Well, Jesus is sitting here talking about, he's teaching them about sexual immorality. Well, to teach about it, you got to know what it is. So that's not what he's saying. At the point that you see another person that's attractive or not attractive, you can keep that in the category of a faithful Christian, or it can devolve into something else in your mind. So at that point, that's when you get into what Jesus is saying. This looking is just this, it's the idea of maybe fantasizing or lacking only the opportunity. So if you had the opportunity to be engaged in sexual immorality with that person, we could talk about pornography, we could talk about other things. So here a person is, I think Jesus is saying just because you don't actually commit the adultery or the fornication doesn't mean you haven't sinned. Like if it's something you're fantasizing about and you're lacking only the opportunity. So that, when you think about when people commit affairs, there's a lot that has gone on in the mind, in the heart, in that situation, and we won't get into all that, but they've thought about it, they've reasoned about it, they may have strategized about it, how to deceive their spouse, how to keep it private from other people. All of that's going on. Think about David when you have the situation with Bathsheba. He's out there, sees a beautiful woman. Could he have at that point said, not going to do that? Yeah. It was presented to him in a temptation, not necessarily Bathsheba's intent. We could get into that conversation, but more just the circumstance and situation. But he could have resisted at that point. But now he has her brought to him. At that point, he could say, what am I doing? This is not right. So you see all of this going on. I think that's what Jesus is getting to when he says, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her, so it's not just the natural desire. You've moved from a natural God-given desire to an evil desire, okay? And it's going on in his heart. And all that happens before what we think of as actual adultery has occurred. And Jesus is saying, and we know the case of David, if David had taken this counsel to heart, in a sense of principle, then think about all the things that wouldn't have happened in his life, all the things that would have been avoided, all the damage in his home and his family. And you think about Absalom and Amnon and Tamar and all of that. And so Jesus is saying, let's start with the heart all the way through this, okay? Now, how aggressive might we have to be to address the heart? Very aggressive. Look at verse 29. If your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you, for it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. That's Gehenna. Jesus talks a lot about Gehenna in his teachings. That's the final abode of hell. Verse 30, if your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it from you, for it's better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell or Gehenna. There's a couple of things to talk about here, but it's interesting. This is true of any sin, anything that's going to prevent me from eternal life, but isn't it interesting where it gets placed? Because he's just talked about lust, and you think about physical appetites. Is he literally talking about plucking your eye, No. He is saying we're going to have to be aggressive in dealing with sin, but there's something else here that's interesting. He talks about your body in hell. Are we going to have a body in hell? Yeah. Remember, there's going to be the resurrection of the righteous and the wicked. So the wicked will be given a body that will be able to last throughout eternity in what's called eternal destruction, but it's not annihilation. And I got to tell you, if annihilation, where just poof, you're gone, if you're wicked, were true, that verse doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, why would you even need, your soul would just be annihilated and you'd be gone. But that's not what's going to happen. And this deals with the consequences. Now, what's interesting about Jesus' statement is 1 Corinthians 6, Paul talks about the problem of sexual immorality. And he talks about our body being a temple of the Holy Spirit. You remember that? And his point is, because we believe in the resurrection, we need to live in sanctification now. God cares what we do with our body. So if you took 1 Corinthians 6 and then you took this statement about, look, you need to be aggressive about dealing with sin because you don't want to go to hell, those things all go together. Does anybody have a comment or a question about any of this? Okay. All right. Let's look at the next section. So let's look at Matthew 5:31 and 32. All of this, though, and let's put it in the right context, all of this has to do with Jesus talking about a violation of our relationship with God and a violation of brotherly love. If you think about lust in this way, he says, lust, this kind of lust, is a violation of brotherly love. All right. Then he goes on to say that unscriptural divorce is a violation of brotherly love. And we don't always think of it that way, but that's the context in which he's talking about. So let's look at it. Verse 31, it was said, whoever sends his wife away or puts her away, depending on your translation, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for, and I'm not crazy, I'll just tell you about the New American Standard rendering of this. I think it's too broad. It says, for the reason of unchastity. I think many translations, I like the old King James, it just says for the reason of fornication. The New King James, does it say sexual immorality? And that's a good enough rendering. It's the word porneia, and we're talking about actual, fornication, sexual immorality, breaking that one flesh relationship. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason or cause of sexual immorality, makes her or causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Let's turn to Matthew 19, very similar. These passages need to be taken in tandem for sure, but they say the same thing just in a different way. I think, to be honest, with some of the struggles some brethren have had on this issue, Matthew 5 is very helpful, and we'll come back to that. Okay, so Matthew 19, let's read Matthew 19 verses 3 through 10. Matthew 19 verses 3 through 10. Adam?
And the Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?" He answered, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother, and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh? They are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." They said to him, "Why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and send her away?" He said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery." The disciples said to him, "If such is the case, a man and his wife, it is better not to marry."
I think they got the point. So let's start with Matthew 19, and then I want to come back to Matthew 5, 31 and 32. So in Matthew 19, let's just stick with what is discussed in these texts without other consideration. So they come to Jesus, and there were probably three major rabbinical views, Jewish views of this. So they know it's an entrapping question because they're thinking whatever he says, he's going to be crossways with some other important group, right? Which is often how they handle things. So the first question, when you're reading a text, the question that he's answering is always very important. So what question? Because we can't fabricate a new question, all right? We can't. You can't say, well, they're just asking about remarriage. Well, remarriage is going to obviously play into this, but what was their question? Go ahead, Daryl.
Or for any cause.
That's it.
Any cause.
Any cause. So the question, and Daryl is right, was, can a man divorce his wife for any cause, for any reason? All right. Now, why would they ask that? You had, you get into Hillel and Shammai and all that, but basically you had, and I'm sure you could probably find other views too, but these were the main ones. You had one view that argued that only for the cause of sexual immorality, that actually defined that in Deuteronomy 24, and we'll come back to that in a minute. So there's that, like only for the uncleanness is only sexual immorality. Okay. Then you had another view, that, and we talked about this, but literally wrote, if she burns the bread, okay? So if she burns the bread, all the women are like, "Oh, Bruce, quit preaching such long sermons and this won't happen." But if she burns the bread, if she does, basically does anything, he can divorce her. And you have to remember, Jewish women, it's not like our society. They didn't have the right to own property. Gentile women did, but own property and divorce. So when Mark's account comes, you have more of a Gentile audience. He'll talk about a woman divorcing her husband, but there's not really a point to do that here. He's actually trying to defend and protect women. Some people miss that point. Okay. So you have sexual immorality, if she burns the bread. Then there's another one, if he sees another woman, I think our society would really like this one, that he deems more attractive than his original wife, then he can divorce the original wife. Okay. So there's all kinds of ideas out there. So they asked Jesus this question, can a man divorce his wife for any reason? Now, you just have to keep in mind, whatever we read after that is flowing out of that question. If Jesus wanted to say, well, yeah, he would have said it. But his answer to this, if we just boil it down, if you had to give me a yes or no, what is Jesus' answer to that question? No. No. All right. Now he sets it up before he gets to his answer. Great case of how to establish scriptural authority, by the way. Notice what Jesus does in Matthew 19. In verse 4, he answered. This is the same thing he's trying to do in a way by going back before the law. What is God's original intent? Verse 4, and he answered and said, have you not read? So you should have read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female. What verse from the Old Testament does verse 4 reference? Genesis 1. So, not Deuteronomy, not the law of Moses. He goes all the way back to the beginning of humanity. Okay? And he says, that's Genesis 1, 26 and 27. He made them male and female. By the way, for those who try to argue that Jesus did not explicitly condemn homosexuality, the Jews understood that that was a sin. Okay, number one. Number two, he defined marriage, and by defining marriage, anything outside of that is sinful. Okay, now then, verse 5. And he said, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Now that's Genesis 2:24. So we have in verse 4 the example of God's creation, divine example. We have in verse 5, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. That's a direct statement. Okay, that's a direct statement. And then in verse 6, the unavoidable conclusion, so they are no longer two but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. So in verse 7, the Jews come back and they say what? Okay, if that's so, they ask him this. What's the next verse say? What'd you say? Well, that's what Jesus says, but what do they say? What do the Jews say? Yeah, why did Moses give us a certificate of divorce to give to her? That would take us back not to Genesis. Jesus has laid it out from Genesis. They go back to Deuteronomy. What's interesting about that is you had men that were just unilaterally, sending their wives away. And you have to remember, Moses is dealing with a theocracy, which means it's a government, what we think of, but it wasn't just a secular government. It was this kind of sacred and organizational altogether. So he's actually trying to define these women to keep these men from just, putting them away. So by giving a certificate of divorce, I don't believe Moses was saying, hey, this is a great thing that you're sending your wives away. In a sense, it actually was somewhat protective of her because now they had something in hand to say this is what happened. So it's not necessarily acceptance. Did God allow that? Yeah. But was God ever pleased with that, his original intent, his original purpose? No, Jesus takes care of that from Genesis. Okay. And there's going to be the explanation to Mike's point. When Jesus says yes, Moses, notice it. It's not that, he was behind you 100%. Moses allowed this, but what does he say? The reason he did was because of the hardness of your hearts. So the problem isn't Moses. Moses doesn't necessarily give you a blank check on this. It was the hardness of your hearts that you did this. But this is not what God intended from the beginning. And there we get the answer to the question. From the beginning, it was not so. So they try to go to Deuteronomy, but Jesus says, look, we're not going to fight about Deuteronomy 24. Well, I don't even have to do that. He goes back to creation. This is God's intent. And so when you get to the kingdom, God's intent. And some people will ask questions about the Old Testament and you get into polygamy and all that. Bottom line is Jesus says this was God's original intent, and with the Messianic kingdom, this is how it's going to be. Because this is God's original purpose. All right. Darryl, what were you going to say?
There was protection in the
Oh, yeah, that's a good point.
You wouldn't want to marry a woman who's already married,
Yeah, that's a good point.
and that document protected both of them.
That's a great point. Yeah. Yeah. And if God was indifferent about it, why would that matter? Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Jason, go ahead.
Question. Adam, what version are you reading from?
New American Standard Bible.
Okay, because in the King James,
Uh-huh.
you know, it says, "And I say unto you, whosoever put away his wife, except to be for fornication, and marry another, committeth adultery." And that's where he stopped. But then in the King James, it says, "And whosoever marrieth her, which
Yeah.
is put away, doth commit adultery." I'm just curious why that's left out.
Okay, say that, read that one more time. Sorry.
Okay, in verse 9, it says, "And I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery." And I think that's where he stopped and went to verse 10.
Yeah.
But now in the King James Version,
Yeah.
it says, "And whosoever
Yeah.
marrieth her which is put away, doth commit adultery."
It's
I'm just curious as to why that's left out.
there's other passages, even with the New American Standard Version, where that's left in the other accounts. It's a manuscript issue. Do you?
It's important to me.
It is important. It is important. But I would say even with the New American Standard Bible, like I told you, I'm not crazy about the unchastity part. That's an independent clause, what you're talking about, and it is important. But in Mark's account and Luke's account, it's still in. It is a manuscript issue.
Well, it seems like it would tie back to that issue before about Moses giving them, you know, the
Right.
woman having the certificate
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
but it's,
Oh, I see what you're saying. With,
that's not so.
Yeah.
It doesn't apply.
yeah. Well, I don't believe the New American Standard Bible translators are removing it because they don't want it, because they have it in Luke's account and Mark's account. So I agree with you, though. Based on the manuscript evidence, I would rather it be there. There's a host of majority receptus. This is a whole different conversation, but where that's not there, even though it's in the older ones. And so you get into a manuscript conversation, but it ends up not being an issue. Now, if they removed it from all the places, then I'd have a major problem with that. But I see what you're saying. So if you read it, the New King James has it too, I think. Does the New King James have that? Yeah, it's a manuscript issue. But back to your point, Jason, I think that is helpful because that's an independent clause, which means it stands on its own, regardless of the previous clause. Yeah.
Or that Moses,
Yeah.
gave the woman the certificate, which allowed her to marry again, but this contradicts that even though she has that certificate.
Well, yeah, well, God did permit that in Deuteronomy. He did allow that, but it doesn't mean he was pleased with it, is what you'd have to argue, because he also permitted polygamy too. I mean, we had, multiple wives with a number of these people, and this comes up often, but I think it's important to your point, and to Jesus' point, to recognize that because God allowed that for a period of time, and I know this brings up a whole nother series of questions, but because he allowed polygamy, for instance, or even this situation, doesn't mean he was pleased with it. And I think that's why Jesus takes us back to Genesis. And with Genesis, we get before the law of Moses. Okay, he just completely escapes Deuteronomy 24 and doesn't get into that debate. He just says, this is the way it was from the beginning. So, now, I see what you're saying. It just depends on what translation. Now, let's look at those other passages. Yeah, we're going to get this. We're going to get back to I think what Jason is saying real quick. Luke 16, and then I want to go back to Matthew 5. Okay. Luke 16, 18. Says, everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries one who is divorced from a husband commits adultery. You have a similar passage in Mark, but let's go back to Matthew. Matthew 5, 31 and 32. And this is one that, and this is what I really wanted make sure we got today and make this point. Matthew 5, verse 32, but I say to you, everyone who divorces his wife except for the cause of fornication causes her to commit adultery. And then look at the next passage, and this is the New American Standard Bible. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So that would be the same, that last clause would be the same that Jason is mentioning in Matthew 19 in the King James and New King James, that if you marry somebody who's been put away, then it's adulterous, right? So now I want to go back though to Matthew 5 because this deals with more than just the remarriage part. It also deals with getting obtaining a divorce for a reason other than fornication in this case. So let's look at it. Verse 32, but I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife except for fornication. So here's a man number one, he divorces his wife. She's not guilty of fornication. He says he causes her to commit adultery. In what sense? Daryl? Okay.
I think it has to do with the custom and the way things were at that time. A woman that has no husband needs a husband to survive.
Right.
In that day more so than now, I think. So the assumption is that you marry a woman that was put away for some reason other than adultery, she's still married.
Yes, she's still bound. That's right. So to that point, if he divorces her for a reason of fornication, he exposes her to the temptation to commit adultery. It's not that just the divorce makes her an adulteress right there, but he exposes her to that. Now, as you look further, and I think that's right, it says causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So here, man number one divorces woman number one, and man number two, unscripturally, I mean not for fornication, and man number two comes and marries her, that's adulterous. Okay, now here's what I want you to see. Man number one, it never says, hey, he went out and committed adultery too. He may or may not have. In this context, the sin for him adultery is not mentioned for him. So what's the sin in Matthew 5 for man number one? Divorce. He put her in a vulnerable situation. He divorced her for a reason other than sexual immorality. Let's say he never remarries again. But look at what he did. Did he sin against God and against her? That's what the text says. Okay. We'll talk about this more, I'm sure, next week. So just hang on to those, and I want to go over some more.